One of the first things you do when getting into a new hobby or interest is turn to your friends or turn to the internet to try to find recommendations and suggestions on how to get into said hobby and interest. And this is pretty universal, whether it's movies or anime or whiskey, you will generally have at the ready a bunch of different suggestions ready and waiting for you. There's a bit of a hive mind when it comes to suggesting anything for beginners. And it's because we've all been there, right? But there's an interesting dynamic at play that I've really started to notice when it comes to beginner or starter recommendations. They're viewed very differently. Whenever something gets elevated to the status of ubiquitousness that is beginner or starter recommendations, it takes on this mantle of being of lesser quality or not as good or refined as other things. And that's a very interesting concept, considering you are telling people who are entering in this hobby and interest that this is the epitome of what they're looking for. This will show you the best that we have to offer. If you like this, you'll like everything else, right? This is the most enjoyable, and everything else from here is an iteration of this or a variation of it, accentuated to be a little bit less accessible. Now, I'm guilty of this as well. In fact, in my last video, I talk about how Inuyasha was one of my favorite series growing up, and it was very influential to me, getting me into anime. But now that I've gotten older and have watched a lot more anime, it has fallen off of my top spots list. And a lot of that had to do with the negative connotation that it's a starter anime. It's what I watched when I first got into it. My tastes have evolved. It's very simple. And while that is true, that doesn't make it any less enjoyable. How many of us will still look at Dragon Ball Z with rose-colored glasses? It's not the perfect anime, but it still has a very special place in our hearts, right? Beginner anime gets a bad rap for seemingly no reason. Yes, it's not as complicated as other titles. Maybe it lacks some nuances, but that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's accessible and it's good. And that's a sort of gatekeeping in and of itself, where you recommend people these really accessible titles that are still really good. And then slowly, as you grow and you watch more, your taste becomes more and more refined, and thus, by nature, less accessible to other people. You have really fine-tuned that, oh, I don't like isekai. I like, slice of life. So therefore, you refine your genres that you watch, right? There's a never-ending process of evolution that takes you down the path of finding what you watch most. But I have to be honest with you, going back and watching the more accessible titles has been really fun. Every title that I've watched so far, you could probably find on a beginner anime list, intro to anime list, whatever you want to call it. And I've had vastly different experiences with each. Soul Eater was a redemption arc for me. I had very negative thoughts and feelings about the show based on the ending, and upon the rewatch, I really fell in love with how they handled characters. And while I still didn't enjoy the ending as much as I would have wanted, I understood where it was going for, and now I can honestly recommend that show to my friends and to peers. Trigun, on the other hand, was like falling in love with your spouse all over again, and that's a very specific and weird analogy, but for those who have experienced that, you'll know what I mean. It's the sensation of having been with somebody for so long, and you love them, but then kind of rediscovering that love, like the flames fan higher, and you fall in love all over again. I remembered nothing of Trigun, just the feelings that it once made me feel, and then to have all of those feelings recreated and brought to the forefront was just an amazing experience. And I'll never forget. And Trigun will never leave my top spots list for influential and favorites. And now I went back and watched Inuyasha, and I have to say, I went in with pretty low expectations. I had the anti-nostalgia goggles on, the nostalgia goggles, right? Where instead of just plain nostalgia goggles making Inuyasha appear better in my mind, honestly, it made it appear worse. I went in not expecting it to be very good, the writing to be bad, it to drag on, and to my surprise, absolutely none of that was really true. I tore into Inuyasha in a way that I haven't torn anime in a long time. Even with Trigun and Soul Eater. Soul Eater was a bit of a slog for me to get through. Trigun, I cherished each episode so much, but Inuyasha, I devoured those episodes and those movies faster and with more reckless abandon than anything in a very long time. So what is Inuyasha, and what, in my opinion, makes it so special? Well, to put it in the most simplistic terms, it's a shonen that doesn't care about fights at all. That might sound really weird and not mesh with what you remember about Inuyasha, but I promise you, the focus of this show is not in any way, shape, or form the fights. And I think that's where I start my love for Inuyasha, because as I've been rewatching old anime from my youth, I've discovered that what really stands out to me is character-focused, relationship-focused story arcs and characters that have a lot of different emotions and ranges and experiences and interactions with one another. Inuyasha at its heart is just an anthology series of them going around collecting the Shikon Jewel. This allows them to create any number of variations on a theme with their squad dynamic, with the mission setups. So much like in Soul Eater, where every character has an episode where it's dedicated to their relationship with another character, Inuyasha has much the same concepts. You have Inuyasha and Kagome, of course. You have Sango and Moroku, but then you also have Moroku and Kagome, Sango and Inuyasha, Shippo and Moroku. Every variation of characters is explored, and while it's not the deepest, it does present itself in a believable way and adds a lot to the characters and the environment that just makes you believe that they are traveling with one another and that they are a close, tight-knit group that is basically family at this point. But I am getting a bit ahead of myself. Let's establish what Inuyasha is. And at its core, it is an isekai that doesn't have a focus really around combat and fight scenes, but rather relationships. Inuyasha is a love story that takes place between Inuyasha and Kagome, and their romance just so happens to take place in feudal Japan that is overrun by all manner of creature from Japanese folklore. To compound their romance even further, Kagome is a 15-year-old girl from the future, while Inuyasha is a 200-year-old half-demon dog with daddy issues. Now, the setup around the romance is pretty simplistic. They are thrust into a quest to reacquire the magical MacGuffin. Every aspect of this show revolves around the magical MacGuffin that is the Shikon Jewel. Largely, Inuyasha is a monster of the week type show. there is a villain that's introduced that has a piece of the Shikon jewel, and they must defeat them. Rinse and repeat for the entirety of the show, and sometimes they throw a wrench into the plan and have a villain stick around for a few episodes. And that is the heart of most criticism that I see with Inuyasha, is that it is very formulaic. It does the same thing over and over again. And if you were to just pick up the show every now and then, it's essentially the same episode every time. And thus, it's a bit boring, and you can quite honestly, rightfully, wrongfully assume that it has no depth. But in my experience of watching everything back to back to back, there is such a steady stream and thread between each episode that adds a lot of subtle depth between everything. Everything is building upon itself. And just because Inuyasha takes its time and fleshes out the world and the characters and explores all of the different creatures in Japanese folklore, doesn't mean that it's boring or that it's too predictable. Inuyasha does a really good job about breaking up its Monster of the Week formula. They'll do a run where they're just going to another village, taking care of a demon, and then all of a sudden there will be a couple episodes where they encounter something different, where it's not exactly all about fighting. It's more of a human story. And that change of pace is so refreshing and welcome in the setting that it resets your cooldown on the formulaic stuff while refocusing on the character-centric aspects of the story. And as the adventure goes on, every character goes through their own arc to create a better version of themselves. Inuyasha, for example, starts off as a hard-headed miscreant, only out for himself. And through the show, we see him evolve into a more kind, gentler spirit who cares about others more than himself. Kagome likewise turns into a very strong, independent woman who is very confident in herself and her abilities and protects her friends when she's able. Each Monster of the Week serves to exemplify one of these aspects and continue the story growth of these characters. And that's quite honestly why it feels so realistic. If Inuyasha was shorter, they wouldn't have the same time to develop all of these characters through repeated actions and repeated vocalizations of their progress and their journey from where they started to where they end up. And again, I understand that that's not for everyone. I see the flaws and the shortcomings of Inuyasha, and it doesn't make a difference for me in my enjoyment. I see those flaws and I accept them, and I love it in spite of, maybe because of, those shortcomings that wouldn't attract everybody else. Inuyasha is very long, and the payoff doesn't come until the very end. But everything between the start and the end is a fun time. And I feel like we get bogged down way too much sometimes about how complex something is or how groundbreaking it is. And at the end of the day, sometimes we just need to ask ourselves, was it fun? Did I enjoy it? And yeah, I enjoyed Inuyasha so much. It was really nice to kind of turn off my brain, to not have to really focus too much to understand what was going on. It was pretty straightforward, and I really enjoyed the earnestness of all of that. Are there some really simplistic characters who are really just one stereotype over again? Yeah, but they do it really well, and they have variation on that stereotype that makes them more robust than a one-dimensional gag. And that's the strength of Inuyasha right there. That ability to take the formulaic monster of the week, the adventure story, and make it all continue a single thread. And that sounds really easy, and it sounds really basic as a concept, but Inuyasha does it, I think, better than any other anime I've seen to date. For as long as it is, every episode, every arc builds on itself. And while you could easily watch Inuyasha out of order, jump around, and get the gist of it, you would be robbing yourself the wholesome experience of seeing the characters develop slowly over time, which is what the length ultimately allows it to do. There are so many aspects of Inuyasha that are amazing, that it makes up for the aspects that aren't quite up to snuff in the modern anime game. As I've said, the fight scenes are not the focus of the show, and as such, they're not really highly animated. Don't go into Inuyasha expecting for extravagant, drawn-out, intricate fight scenes. Every fight is going to end in the same ways. It's going to be Inuyasha using his sword techniques, the wind scar, the backlash wave, maybe his soul reaver, or maybe it's Moroku using his wind tunnel, or maybe it's Kagome firing a sacred arrow. That is the assured outcome of every single fight. And it doesn't get old. They find a way to make sure that the inevitability of the good guys winning is assured, but that's not where the weight of the situation is. You're never worried that the gang is not going to succeed, but you are worried about the situations they're put in and how that's going to affect their relationships instead of their lives, which is honestly very refreshing. Rewatching Inuyasha has taught me that nostalgia goggles go both ways. You can remember things more positively, and also you can remember them negatively. You cannot remember the full glory of something as well. And I think Inuyasha suffers from that. A lot of people I've talked to remember watching it and remember liking it, but wouldn't necessarily go back and rewatch it or think that it would hold up. And I'm so glad that I went into this with such low expectations. It deserved better, yes, but it was able to show that to me, and it really proved that Inuyasha is honestly underrated anime. I think I have to place it back on one of my top spots list. I enjoyed every second of watching Inuyasha so much that it really blew me away and surprised me with how much I enjoyed it. So next time you're thinking about the anime you watched as a kid and whether or not it's good or holds up, use my experience with Inuyasha to guide you. Maybe it's time to go back and rewatch some of those older classics. Maybe it's time to shift the gatekeeping mentality. Just because something is starter or beginner doesn't mean it's lesser quality. If anything, it means it's greater quality. You are showcasing this to people as the be-all end-all of what anime can be. And what Inuyasha specifically shows to young viewers and impressionable viewers, or viewers who are new to anime as a whole, is that not everything has to be over-the-top macho, in your face, lewd, all of the above, because it showcases a very human-centric story. Relationships, emotions first above everything else, and teaches kids how to process trauma and love and hard feelings. Inuyasha adds a refreshing take on the isekai and the shonen genre by throwing away the cardinal aspect of those shows, which is that everything must revolve around fight scenes and through violence. And while there is plenty of violence in Inuyasha, that is not the overarching message. The message is one of love, of kindness, of strife is not something that we have to put up with. We can work towards a better tomorrow. Every part of the anime showcases how hard life is and the importance of choosing to be human and to not lose your humanity. And I think that's a very salient and important talking point. I'm not going to break down the overarching story and how everything ends up in this video, because I truly believe either you already know or you don't, and you should go experience all that for yourself, which I highly recommend you do. Inuyasha is so much better than it has any right to be, and quite honestly is quite better than most of us think it is. So please go revisit Inuyasha. I think you'll find yourself pleasantly surprised.